Good morning! Hey guys, and welcome to another week of learning about the kingdoms of life. Today we're going to cover the coolest kingdom, which is definitely not opinion and is definitely objective fact, which is plants. Plants are, in my opinion, the coolest kingdom. We're going to talk about why that is and all of their diverse features here, so let's go ahead and dive in. Let's get to the root of this subject. Anyway, okay, so what is a plant? Officially, a plant is a non-motile multicellular eukaryote. Wait, what? Whoa, hang on. A lot of words there. Let's break it down. Basically, because plants are eukaryotes, they're multicellular, which means that they have a nucleus and they have membrane-bound organelles like chloroplasts and vacuoles and the endoplasmic reticulum and all that fun stuff. They also, many of them, have photosynthetic pigments like chlorophyll that makes them green. So you can see all of these examples down below have that, although not all plants have this. We're going to take a look at some examples of plants that are not, in fact, green and don't have chlorophyll. Dun dun dun! And most of them have some sort of form of an anchor to the ground or to some substance. These can be roots or rhizoids or all different kinds of stuff. But basically the idea is to keep them anchored where their vertical shoots can kind of grow out and explore their environment. They are one of the most diverse kingdoms. They have colonized basically most places on Earth, and they're really incredible. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few more of their features here. But the big ones here, are just to clarify, cell walls made of cellulose, that's a big one, and photosynthetic pigments like chlorophyll. Okay, so like all other life on Earth, everything came from the sea. And plants came a long time ago from the sea. So when you look way back on this, plants, I mean, they started evolving sort of right after the algae started evolving millions and millions and millions of years ago. But most plants were constrained because they had to have light, right? Most plants were photosynthetic, and so they could only survive in the shallows of the water. And they stayed in the water for a really long time. In fact, what's really incredible to think about is that land plants like trees, which we normally think of as just being plants, that's the plants we usually see, the terrestrial plants, those didn't actually evolve until after fish and giant dinosaurs in the ocean and all of these other things had already been moving around. In fact, mammals came about before most of the modern plants that we see today, which is really weird to think about. They spent a long, long time in the water. And one of the big reasons why it took them so long to get out is that they had to undergo massive changes to allow them to come out of the water and to live on land. Now that's also true of animals, and we see that sort of progression, that step-by-step progression of animals going from things like fish to things like, amphibians and things like that. It's sort of or amphibious tetrapods, things that were able to sort of live inside and out of water, and then they slowly began moving. The same thing happened to plants, but it took them a really long time to be able to adapt. And plus, they had it pretty good in the shallows, It's not like they really needed to expand a whole lot, but once they expanded to land and they were able to figure out the dry land thing, they were then able to diversify and take over just a huge portion of the land. And of course, that was essential for the animals that would eventually move to the land, because they, of course, needed to rely on all the energy that the plants could capture from the sun. So, pretty cool. So when we're talking about plants, I just want you to think about all of the adaptations you're going to see are adaptations to a dry land environment. Okay, so let's take a look at some key features of the plant cell. I mean, we know already that plant cells are like angular. They aren't round like animal cells most of the time. We know that partly that's because they have a cell wall, which is that rigid cellulose structure that goes all the way around the plant cell. We also see here that this is the nucleus, but this giant thing next to the nucleus, what is that? I mean, in animal cells, the nucleus is usually the largest organelle. So what in the heck is this? Well, that is the large central vacuole. So plants have this giant, basically, storehouse, this giant bubble in which they can keep excess water and food and sugars if they're photosynthesizers and all the stuff that they need. But the vacuole doesn't just store things. It also exerts pressure against the cell wall. So if you imagine the cell wall as being this rigid structure, the cell wall being a rigid structure that doesn't have a lot of flex, a little bit, but not a lot, the more that you inflate this central vacuole, the more it's going to press against all the organelles in the cytoplasm and build pressure inside the cell wall. That's going to either allow the cell wall to be rigid, or if the large central vacuole actually shrinks in size, the cell wall might actually become a little flaccid or a little limp. which means that the plant would start to wilt. So if you guys have ever wondered why plants wilt or how they're able to stand upright even if they don't have a hard woody substance on the outside like bark, the way that they can do that is through this turgor pressure. So if the turgor pressure is really strong, the plant can stand up regardless of whether or not it has wood on its stem or anything like that. It's not the thickness of the plant stem, it's actually that pressure that's inside, and most of it's due to water building up inside of this. This is one of the reasons why plants need so much water. But that high turgor pressure allows plants to be able to grow to incredible heights, to be able to better reach sunlight, and to grow to explore their environment. So turgor pressure is extremely important for plant survival. A low turgor pressure, which means that the plant isn't getting usually enough water, means that the plant cells will actually start to sort of shrink inside of the cell wall, and the cell wall will partially collapse, and so the plant will kind of wilt, it'll kind of bend, it won't be able to get that pressure and that height. So this is one of the key features of plants, is having this large central vacuole that allows them to be able to control that turgor pressure. Plasmodesmata between cells are like these little channels that allow water and nutrients to flow between the cell walls, and this helps the plants to be able to keep that turgor pressure and to transport nutrients and supplies between cells all the way through the plants. Now the features I'm telling you about plants are mostly based off of what we would think of as being the more modern or recently evolved plants, like, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, like angiosperms, flowering plants, and gymnosperms, which are plants with exposed seeds. However, this is just in general a good rule of thumb when we're talking about plant features. Of course, when we talk about the exceptions to this, we'll note what they are and the reason why they are exceptions. Okay, so how do plants move? Of course, plants like fungi are non-motile because they're anchored to some sort of substance using roots or rhizomes or whatever. So they can't just walk around. But they can grow to explore their environment. So things like vines that we see here on this trellis on the left, the vines are able to grow up the sides of the trellis, and they're actually, the tips of the vines are able to sort of detect where the next structure is so they can kind of wrap around it and continue to pull the plant's weight up. So that's one way that they can explore. Of course, we see that trees and other things grow up and their branches go out and all that sort of stuff. And of course, the roots are exploring underneath the ground for the nutrients and the water and all that kind of thing. Rhizomes, which are not roots but are like stems that grow across the ground or underground, can travel long distances and sprout up new shoots wherever they're needed. So there's all sorts of options as to how plants can grow around their environment in directions they want to explore. Plants can also explore and move around their environment using seeds that have wings or have some sort of tuft on them that can catch the wind. So wind-borne or water-borne seeds are another very common way that plants are able to get around. Now, plants mostly get their energy from the sun, okay? So typically, when you think of plants, you should usually think autotrophs or producers, right? They take the energy from the sun, and they use CO2 and water to convert that energy into sugar, to store it into chemical energy that can be used by them and by other organisms. Very efficient process, right? Allows them to be able to build up a lot of food just using the sun and the stuff around them. So that's really cool, and that's the reason why they're so important in our food webs and food chains. There are some plants, however, that don't photosynthesize, and they don't have those photosynthetic green pigments. You can see an example of this in the very middle. I always grew up learning this was called Indian pipestem. It has many different names, and essentially it is a parasitic plant. So its roots are going to grow into the roots of other plants and steal their nutrients. Therefore, they don't need the photosynthetic pigments, so you can see that they're white in color. They don't actually, remember the whole point of the pigment that makes them green, most plants, is to be able to absorb the light from the sun to transfer it to sugar. But here, I mean, we don't need that because we're living off of someone else. We're essentially a heterotroph, a parasite, and so we don't need that anymore. The plant can be white. We also see that there are a few plants, though rare, that can actually consume organisms for their added nutrients and energy. So like the Venus flytrap, you can see it's green, so it is photosynthetic, but in times where it doesn't want to rely on that photosynthetic process or it's not providing it enough energy, it can also grab hold of flies or grubs or worms or whatever else can crawl in there, whatever insect crawls into its mouth, and it can digest those to get those extra nutrients and proteins and stuff that it needs. We usually call those mixotrophs, which means that they can basically use either or, heterotroph through consuming or autotroph. You could also, I guess you could maybe call it a photoheterotroph. There's all sorts of ways to describe it, but these plants are few and far between. Most plants are going to be autotrophic and have those photosynthetic pigments. Now, plant reproduction. This is fun. This is where we start to see the big changes that plants had to undergo in order to go from water to land. So most plants, or many plants, utilize alternation of generations, which, if you remember, means we switch between sexual and asexual reproduction. There is, however, a lot of variation in how this occurs, and we're going to look at two different examples of plant life cycles here in a second to sort of go over some of the differences. In addition to having spores like fungi, plants can also reproduce using seeds. And this is another dry land adaptation. Seeds are basically these small little vessels that include the zygote, which, if you remember, is the combination of an egg and a sperm. It's basically the little baby plant as a little embryo, basically, and a prepackaged food source that surrounds it, which we call the endosperm. The seed coat that surrounds the seed keeps it hard. So if you've ever eaten sunflower seeds or something, they're kind of crunchy. The seed coat is to help protect whatever is inside from losing water and drying out. So again, this is one of those dry land adaptations. Seeds are basically plants that are in these little space pods, if you want to think of it that way. The land is a very harsh environment for them, and so they basically have to lock their young into these little space pods and send them out into the land, hoping that they don't dry out and that the outer shell of that space pod remains intact until there's enough water and good conditions around them to emerge from the pod, right? And of course, though, however, they can still use spores, which again are another dry land adaptation to help them to survive. And interestingly enough, they can either use a wind-borne pollen, like this one right here. Here we have a pollen cell, which is basically sperm all packaged up that can be delivered to a female flower to fertilize it, or they can actually use swimming sperm, much like us. So they have sperm that actually have tails and swim around in water and everything. So it just depends on the adaptation of the plant. Now, again, plant life cycles can be really confusing and complicated, so let's take a look at these two right here. I've given you a fern, which is a pteridophyte. It's an older style of plant, which I mean it evolved a lot before plants like this with flowers. So ferns, you can see here, we have a haploid, which means, the half amount of chromosomes, so it has one of each chromosome instead of two, like the normal body cells would. So our sex cells are haploid, if you don't remember. So we have this haploid or in generation that is going to be here, and we can see here that those are going to produce what we call a gametophyte. Now your gametes are your sex cells, so we can imagine that gametophyte just means a structure that has sex cells. It evolves into the mature gametophyte, and we actually end up getting two different structures. We get sperm that are going to swim, and then we get the egg that's going to develop, and the sperm are going to swim down into the egg and fertilize it. It's weird, right? It seems like a lot like an animal. We get the zygote, and the zygote is actually going to develop a sporophyte. So we can see here the gametophyte's still down here, but the sporophyte is going to be the thing that actually grows up and develops leaves. That's going to be like the photosynthetic thing, and it's going to have again these like spores on it, which is really weird because we're like, wait a second, we started with spores, now we had sperm and egg, and now we're back to spores. What's happening? And so we have these spores again, and then the spores are going to release, and those are going to go back into the cycle. And we can see here, this is when we have the sperm and the egg joined together, we get that diploid zygote, just like we do in human fertilization, where we get the haploid egg and the haploid sperm joined together, and they form into a diploid zygote, that diploid body cell that grows into the actual body of the organism. So here's one version of this. Now notice that it's not asexual, it's sexual all the way through. And so in this case, and actually both of these are sexual all the way through, there are some examples of plants that do have an asexual method, so they can clone themselves and create multiple different versions of themselves using rhizomes. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But here you can see they alternate between the haploid and diploid life cycles. Unlike us, where our haploid cycle is literally just our sex cells, here they actually have a structure that forms and develops before we actually get to the sexual or diploid life cycle stage. Over here we see in an angiosperm, which is a flowering plant, we can see the spores, and they go down and they grow. Spores are really just the pollen grains, and they go down into the female part of the flower, and they go ahead and they. This is terrible. This thing is horribly in the way. But let me see if I can get it to go away. So they grow down into that, and that goes ahead and fertilizes the egg, and then that goes ahead and develops into a mature seed. The seed then sprouts into a sporophyte, and the process continues. So it's a variation on the same theme. We go from a haploid to a diploid stage. It just depends on what we're growing. In this case, the gametophyte isn't really as obvious with the angiosperm as it was in the fern. We didn't grow the gametophyte first and then go to the sporophyte. The sporophyte actually just came up right away. And I guess if you wanted to, you could say the gametophyte is almost like the ovary and the flower, but it's far less distinct. So very, very varied life cycles, and you don't need to know all of these details or anything. I just want to impress upon you how complex plant life cycles can be in comparison to what we would think of as like animal life cycles, where it's easy. We have sperm and an egg, mix the two together, we make a new organism. It's a lot less, fewer steps. Okay, so we split plants into four major groups. Those four major groups are, of course, based off of unique characteristics that are within each one. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at those. We're really going to just be looking at the four major groups of land plants. There are green plants, so things that grow underwater and stuff, but those are the more primitive ones. We're going to look at the ones that are more, I guess, are going to apply more to us, are going to be the land plants. So we're going to look at the ferns, the bryophytes with the mosses, and then the two different types of seed plants, which are going to be gymnosperms and angiosperms, the flowering plants. Okay. All right, so bryophytes are the mosses. Now, they can only survive in very wet environments. These guys are the ones that we think first evolved to live a life partially on land. So from the algae that was originally in the water that eventually formed or evolved into, rather, different lineages split apart, and eventually whatever lineage is going to become plants eventually formed into the bryophytes. So the bryophytes have characteristics that are very much more suited towards water living than towards land living. They don't have true roots or leaves, so they can't absorb water from the soil through their roots. They actually just have rhizomes or rhizoids, which are just anchors into the ground. And they don't have true leaves, so they can photosynthesize. They're photosynthetic, but they don't have leaves that really make that process very efficient. They also lose a ton of water all the time. I mean, they can't stop from losing water. It just evaporates out of them constantly. They also require water to be able to allow their sperm to swim to female mosses to be able to fertilize them so that their sporophytes can grow and they can actually reproduce. So they still heavily depend upon water. They're unable to live without it, so they have to live in very, very moist environments. So we can see that they also don't have any internal veins or vascular tissue. So in plants, there's two different types of vascular tissue. There's xylem and phloem, and those are the tubes that carry your water and the tubes that carry your sugar. And those, in modern or more recently evolved plants, those really help those plants to be able to survive in a dry land environment because they easily and efficiently transport water and nutrients from the roots up through the plant. Here we don't have those absorptive roots, and we don't have that internal network. So they have to rely on water literally just falling on top of them and absorbing it into their cells directly. Again, this means that they really require a very moist environment. What's cool about this is we can see this is the first attempt that plants are coming out of the water. They still super rely on it, but they have those anchors to keep them inside the soil. And of course, they're getting better access to sunlight on the surface, so we can see the benefit of doing this. It's just that, of course, if the water does happen to go away or dry out, they're going to die really quickly. So pteridophyta are going to be the next step. So they are whatever bryophyta branch sort of branched off and eventually evolved into pterophyta. Pterophyta sort of took another closer step towards living on dry land. So they can include some mosses, which is confusing, but those mosses have very different features than the mosses in bryophyta. They have absorbative roots and stems, so they're able to absorb water directly from their roots, like you would think a normal plant would. And they do also have true leaves, and vascular tissue. So here they have actually developed that internal plumbing that allows them to very efficiently transport water and nutrients all through their body. It allows them to be able to live in drier environments. However, they still rely upon their sperm to have water to work. So their sperm still have the tails and they still have to swim in the water. So they're still dependent and mating upon a water source. They also they don't have a lot of connective tissues between their cells, so they have to kind of rely on water hitting all around them or hitting all around their leaves as well as in their roots, just so that they can get that maximum absorption. So again, we see that they're moving closer and closer to being able to survive on a dry land environment, but they're still kind of far away. They do use spores instead of seeds, so we still haven't gotten to the seeds yet, and the spores can, for the most part, survive in dry land. But again, in order for that fertilization process to happen, we still need water for the sperm. Gymnosperms. Okay, so gymnosperms are the first seed-bearing plants, and these guys evolved out of some lineage, probably of Pteridophyta. And this is the first time where we really see plants able to take off and take full advantage of that dry land environment. So gymnosperms, because they use seeds, they have that awesome little package that they can go ahead and send out, and it'll be kept safe for a really long time in a dry land environment, and it'll be able to survive and have food built into the seed that allows for the embryo to be able to grow really quickly. They are also evergreens, so they're able to capture sunlight year-round through their leaves, which are very much like needles, like pine needles. And they reproduce by wind-borne pollen. Now, this is one of the most exciting adaptive features of plants for land, because basically what this means is that now, instead of having to rely on their sperm to be able to have to swim everywhere through water, now they can actually rely upon that sperm being packaged in a dry container that can be delivered directly to a female reproductive organ, and the sperm, instead of having to swim down, there's like a pollen tube that extends from the pollen grain and delivers the sperm directly to the egg. So we don't need water for this to be able to happen. We just need the sperm to be able to just fly through the air. And so this is a huge land adaptation. This was one of the final things to allow plants to really kind of sever that direct tether to water and allow them to move more and more inland. So a lot of the first forests would have been conifers or evergreens or gymnosperms. Now, their seeds are exposed, unlike in flowers, like in the cones of pine trees. And of course the cones are a protective structure to be able to protect them, but of course they can't protect them from everything. Squirrels constantly eat their seeds and everything, so their seeds are going to be exposed. But still a better solution, in this case, the spores and the sperms having to swim. Here they don't have to do that. They can rely on the seeds. They can travel a lot further inland. In addition, their stems can also be protected by wood. So here we actually start to see those woody plants and stems developing, and that lignin, which is basically the scientific term for wood, is going to allow them to, again, increase water retention and protect them from losing water or from occurring damage to their bodies. They can grow larger now in size. Okay, finally we get to angiosperms. Angiosperms are the most diverse group of plants on the surface of the earth. They include anything that has a flower. So that includes fruit trees, flowers in your garden, vegetables, anything that has a flower is an angiosperm. Now they have true leaves, roots and stems, and vascular tissue, so they have the whole bundle, everything needed to be in a dry land. And they use covered seeds. Now this is really cool. So instead of having their seeds just be covered and gymnosperms try to protect them, but it's hard, angiosperms actually kind of embrace their seeds are going to be either going to be consumed by other organisms, or they add a protective shell around them. So they cover their seeds in fruits. Those fruits are going to allow for those seeds to not only be protected, but also have a store of energy. The fruit, like the apple, the meat of the apple, is all meant to be energy for those growing apple seeds. But also, it makes them so that certain animals will want to eat them. And angiosperms really want this. Angiosperms can use the animals eating their seeds to actually move their seeds around. So instead of having to rely on wind pollination or something, if an animal comes along and eats a fruit and swallows the seeds can actually survive in their digestive system. And when the animal poops about, the seeds will have the animal's poop to fertilize them, and they'll be growing in a different place, able to so that they can spread all throughout the environment rather than having to rely on some other method of getting around. So this is another really cool method of movement. Angiosperms also harness animals in another way by attracting pollinators to their flowers. By producing a little bit of nectar in their flowers, the plants make it really tempting for animals to come and eat that nectar out of the flower, which makes it so that when the animals come down to eat the nectar, they get the pollen all over them, and then they visit other flowers and they pollinate all the flowers, thus spreading the sperm around and allowing plants to reproduce very easily to create their seeds. So basically, here's how I think about it. Angiosperms are the ultimate gymnosperm, in a way. They're not the same thing, because they have obviously different features. But angiosperms are where plants got to the full dry land capacity. They were like, okay, we can survive anything that this dry land has to throw at us. And now we're actually going to start manipulating the other organisms that live here to help do some of our tasks for us. So instead of us having to rely on the wind or something else, instead of us having to provide all of these services of getting our seeds out, of pollinating, of getting water and all that sort of stuff, they're able to rely on other organisms to be able to do some of these functions for them. So it's really, really cool how they were able to adapt to dry land, not only to the physical environment of dry land, but to the other organisms that had already learned to live on it. So pretty incredibly intelligent. If you think about it, it's really cool how angiosperms were able to evolve that way. So today, plants typically make up the root of our ecosystems and our food chains, our trophic levels. They capture energy from the sun, make it into sugars, and feed everyone else. Without them, all the heterotrophs and everything would be in serious, serious trouble. And so now, today, even though they weren't really there for a really long time, today they are like the major players and roles of our terrestrial ecosystems. Until plants are really able to firmly establish themselves, we didn't see that incredible explosion of life like we do now, and all of those unique forms that are able to survive off of plants' energy. So plants do a lot more than just provide energy, though. They also supply food for most of us. So that is still energy, but it's different. It's if we think about the human population, we're very different than other organisms in that our population is massive compared to others. And so we really need a massive food supply, and plants supply most of that food. Most of the food substances you eat, even if you eat a lot of beans, or even if you eat a lot of meat or cheese and stuff like that, most of the products that you consume are going to be plant-based. So it's really super vital for a lot of areas of the world, basically the whole world, to be able to survive and to maintain our human population. They also are great filters. So we've learned that if there's radiation damage, like in Chernobyl or something, we can actually plant plants there. The plants will absorb all the radioactivity and actually sort of cleanse the area around them of radiation, which is really incredible. They can also filter any toxic substances in the soil, and they're really important in marshes and wetlands for not only stabilizing the soil to prevent erosion, but also to be able to filter all the flood water and stuff that comes through. Plants can also provide a lot of fuel for our vehicles. So whether you're talking about a biofuel, like a corn-based fuel, or the fossil fuels that you guys burn in your cars and vehicles and lawnmowers every day, all of these are dependent upon plants. And of course, they constantly take in greenhouse gases like CO2 and release oxygen so that we can breathe fresh air. So plants are amazing. They're awesome. To me, they're incredible. I mean, they're the astronauts of the terrestrial world, if you think about it. They're the foundation of our food chains. They supply so much, and they do it all without even being able to move around like animals. Like, they're just so incredible. So I hope I've convinced you that plants are the coolest kingdom. If not, that's totally okay. Animals are also really freaking awesome. I understand, and who can say no to protists? But I'll leave that to you and your own personal opinions. All right, guys. Hope you have a wonderful day. Enjoy this lesson about plants, and make sure to spend a couple minutes today standing outside, breathing some of that awesome fresh air. And don't forget to thank your plants. All right, guys. Take care.